If things start to get tougher, does that mean something's gone wrong? Well, of course that can be true, but it's not always true, and maybe we shouldn't assume it's true. Tough and good can actually go together. In fact, that's what we're going to discover in the story of Joseph and the Christmas story in Matthew chapter 1 in our series Surprise. Life never goes how we think. What happens when God's way is harder than we thought? We're going to explore it together. I encourage you to invite someone to watch along with you and download those teaching notes so you can follow along and come back to the scriptures this week. Here we go.
Into our message today, I would love for you to grab your Bibles and go to Matthew chapter 1. We've been looking at the Christmas story through the eyes of a biblical author named Luke, a historian. Matthew was one of the closest friends and followers of Jesus. His story is great. I don't have time to tell it, but I'm just going to tell you, he kind of pulls all the history of God's people together in some really cool ways. And he actually focuses on the story where last week we looked at Luke through the eyes of Luke at the life of Mary. Today we're going to look at the life of Joseph in our series called Surprise. Tell somebody surprise. Because here's the deal. This is how life is. It never goes how you think. Can I get an amen? You make all the best plans. You meet all the best people. You lay out all the best resources and all the kind of things, and something inevitably shocks you, surprises you, takes a weird twist or a turn somewhere along the way. Life's just full of surprises. How do we navigate that really well is what we're asking. So again, Matthew chapter 1, if you haven't found your way there, there's a QR on the back of the seats if you need to scan it. But we're finding our way. How do we navigate a life characterized by surprise? Today, in a particular way, through the eyes of Joseph, I want to look at the idea of difficulty. Can things be tough and good at the same time? Because not all surprises in our life are good. And sometimes we have the habit when things go south or go sideways, we just want to find a way out. But I think there's actually a different thing that God invites us into. Every single one of us has navigated tough surprises in our life or is about to. That's just how life is. How do we do that really faithfully? How do we do that really well? And what can we learn from Joseph in particular? Can it be tough at the same time? So Matthew chapter 1, if you haven't found your way there, let me buy you just another minute. Here's an image to help you walk through what we're going to walk through. I don't know if you know this, but in just this past week was National Donut Day. Did you know this? I know, that was a weird right turn. Surprise. Stay with me. Anyway, I read somewhere that it was National Donut Day. Now, spoiler alert, it was not National Donut Day. That was in June, but it didn't stop me from getting a donut anyway. And as I was enjoying my donut and about to go on a hike, it reminded me of one of my second favorite cinnamon donut I've ever had in my life, second only to the orchard right up here. It was at the top of Pikes Peak. You ever been to Pikes Peak? Never heard of it? It's this giant mountain, 14,110 feet, just outside of Colorado Springs, Colorado. Now, what you need to know about Pikes Peak is you can drive to the top in about 30 minutes from, or about an hour, about 30 miles, about an hour from Colorado Springs. You just get in your car and just tool your way up to 14,000 feet. It's really super simple. There's a parking lot right there at the top. You can do that. Or you can ride a cog train, which just like climbs its way up the side of the mountain as well in about 90 minutes. And it's a pretty beautiful ride, I hear, supposedly. But there's another way to get to the top of the mountain, and that is walking. And that is the way we decided to go. So I just gotta say, I knew that you could drive to the top, and I knew you could take a train to the top, but after we had walked for about 3.5 hours, for about 7 miles, up vertical feet of about 4,000 feet, we were exhausted. We had wanted to quit a number of times. In fact, a few of our buddies were napping in the sun a couple miles behind us because they decided the donuts weren't worth it. And as we finally clawed our way to the top, every breath harder than we thought at 14,000 feet, we finally reached the top, and there it is, parking lot. People getting out of their minivans in shorts while we're all bundled up in gloves and hats and everything else. And I'm gonna shoot you straight, I was a little bitter. And at least a little judgmental at the same time. But I'll tell you what, while we stood in line with people who had driven their way to the top, people who just popped right off the little cog train right there at the Summit Cafe to get their donuts, as we stood in line to get our donuts with them, I guarantee you, our donuts tasted way better. Like, way better. That experience was awesome at the other end of something very, very tough. Can things be tough and good? Sure they can. But sometimes we forget that, especially in the middle of tough. I want to be really sensitive to people who are right in the middle of tough right now, because Christmas can be tough. and medical journeys can be tough. Relationships can be tough, and there's a lot of surprises in our life, and I hope Christmas is full of a lot of really great surprises. I hope people are even more excited about the gifts that you bought them than you could have even possibly imagined. I hope people show up for you in ways that are just like so pleasantly surprising, but the truth is we can't be honest about surprise in our life and not talk about the challenging surprises on the other side. Can things be tough and good? This is actually one of the things that makes us followers of Jesus. While some had arrived quickly at the top of the mountain, and some had arrived without much cost, we had taken a pretty tough route, and it made the arrival especially good. Absolutely, things can be tough and good. Now, I gotta shoot you straight. That all sounds really inspiring and all that, but when we looked at the map, the route looked super flat. Did you know this? When you look at a map, in fact, I love the way the National Park says it. It says, trails often look more flat on a map. Pro tip. It's easy to look at someone's journey from the outside and like, oh, 7 miles, 4,000 feet. No, it's a different thing to walk it. And so I don't presume to know what you're walking right now or how tough it feels right now. I'm just saying God has something important and meaningful to say to you, even in the middle of tough. It comes straight out of Matthew chapter 1. I'll start in verse 18. It says this, this is how Jesus, the Messiah, the one who was promised, the anointed one, the one that God, for all of the history of the Hebrew people, the Israelite people, had promised, was born. His mother, Mary, who we talked at length about last week, was engaged to be married to Joseph. Now, we don't know a ton about Joseph coming into this moment, but in general, here's what you could have expected. That Joseph and Mary had an arranged, intended marriage. They were betrothed to one another, which isn't totally different than engagement now. It's not all of marriage, but it is like a commitment and an intent to move toward marriage. It was actually more legally binding in the first century than we would consider it now. For us, it's kind of a step forward in relationship, and until the wedding day, not a lot necessarily has changed, but in the first century, there had already been kind of some agreements made between families, and the only way to step out of this kind of relationship was essentially a divorce, the equivalent of a divorce. They were on their way, so expectations were not just heightened by the engagement, they were promised by the engagement. And so you move through a period in the first century of about up to a year where the husband goes and prepares the place that they'll live, make sure things are ready financially. The celebration is prepared, which would last up to like 7 days or so. And then off they would go in a life together. Joseph and Mary were on that kind of journey. And as much as we polish up and shine the Christmas story, the Bible is not full of heroes who navigate everything perfectly. The Bible is full of humans who God engages in powerful ways. And so I really want to invite you. I don't want to sound flippant at any point in this story, but I do want to embrace the humanity of this guy, Joseph, in his journey. Not to the exclusion of anyone else's, but also let's not just polish it up and make it like a front yard nativity scene or a manteltop nativity scene where everything's shiny and happy and perfect. What happens next is the surprise, the first surprise that Joseph gets. It says this, before, this is verse 1 still. But before the marriage took place, meaning the ceremony, while she was still a virgin, she became pregnant through the power of the Holy Spirit. Surprise, tell somebody, surprise. Like just put yourself in that situation. You're engaged and suddenly there's a baby on the way. You weren't involved. Again, don't shine it up. That's tricky, that's hard. And we're gonna read the story unfold in just a few verses in a very few minutes, but that's not how life unfolds, is it? Everybody else hears blips and updates on your story, but you live your story moment to moment, days long, hours at a time, weeks at a time, as you wait on different things to come back, or you sit in the grief of different kinds of things. This is real loss. A counselor, actually my dad told me this one time. He said, listen, all change is loss. And all loss has to be grieved, and mourning is grief gone public. There had to be some grief in Joseph. He had full expectation. Everything was on track the way that it ought to go. And now his fiance shows up and says, I'm pregnant. And by the way, no person did this, God did this. We're all very, very formal in the Bible, but if you met a person on the street who told you that, you would look at them like they're crazy. Can I get a yep? I imagine a lot of people around her did too, even though they were people full of faith. Or they would have drawn another conclusion. I bet you can guess what that conclusion was. First, I'm just saying, there's a lot of loss, a lot of change. There's a big surprise. Verse 19. Joseph, to whom she was engaged, was a righteous man, which doesn't mean perfect. There are no perfect people other than Jesus himself. Can I get a yep from everybody here? Bunch of perfect people in progress on the way. Joseph, to whom she was engaged, was a righteous man, which means he cared a lot about the things of God, and so he didn't want to disgrace her publicly. So he decided to break the engagement quietly. Now listen, we know how culture works around us. We have just natural conclusions that we've drawn. You've already drawn some about Joseph and Mary if you just even try to put yourself in their situation. But culturally, there were essentially two options, and everybody knew exactly what they were for Joseph. One would be to make this a public spectacle so that he could maintain all of his honor and position in society and make sure all stigma with this situation was then attached to Mary. So he could drag her to trial, and legally she could be stoned to death. That wasn't likely to happen, but it could happen, and at least what it would do is disgrace her publicly, making it even more difficult than ever for her to have a future of any kind, especially after her parents passed away. Plan B wasn't a lot better. Plan B was just make it less public. Go ahead and do the divorce so the engagement is off. But still, Mary now has a child without a mother. She'll live fine, maybe in the home of her family until her family can no longer take care of her. And then she essentially has no options. Hopefully, her son at that point can provide. Tough situation. Verse 20, he's considering all the natural options. It says this, as he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Joseph, son of David, the angel said, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child within her was conceived by the Holy Spirit. And she will have a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save people from their sins. Now listen, if you're finding your way in the direction of Jesus, sin is everything that wrecks our lives, that makes it less than what God intended for it to be. Sometimes it's our choice, sometimes it's others' choice, sometimes it's the brokenness of the world. It's basically anything that is not what God wants. And we always hear that in terms of our individual thing, but Joseph wouldn't have heard it that way. He would have heard it as the consequence of a whole people group. That Israel was under the oppression of Rome and others, and God had not been speaking widely to that group of people for about 400 years because of their collective sin. And so Joseph is getting a picture now of what this baby was supposed to do, that God was saying, in this miraculous moment, God is up to something huge, Joseph, and you are invited to be a part of it. So he had a natural fear about, stepping into this kind of marriage, because not only would he raise a son that wasn't, at least culturally, technically his, and what would happen next is that people would actually probably assume that it was his and that he was lying too. Now his reputation is definitely on the line. His firstborn, to whom the legacy of his family would go, would not actually be his, or at least not in the way that he would have thought. He had all kinds of fears and resignations, but God shows up and says, let me put you at ease. The road ahead is not easy. Can things be tough and good? Can I get a yep? They're about to be, Joseph. He puts him at ease. He will save all of God's people collectively from their sin. He will rescue you. And Joseph probably even heard this politically. We won't go into it today, meaning a nation called out of the oppression of Rome. But however he heard it, God was up to something big, and it was communal, not just personal. Now, what we get next is an editorial note from the author, Matthew. Like I said, he's a follower of Jesus. He said, all of this occurred to fulfill the Lord's message through his prophet, which came from hundreds of years before. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means what? God with us. Now, listen, Joseph has received this message, or we're receiving the message of who Jesus is. Jesus means God is my salvation, and he'll save us from our sin, meaning he'll rescue all people back into relationship with God. And the way that he'll do that comes in the second name, Emmanuel. He will be with us. Not God at a distance, God up close. Verse 24 says this, when Joseph woke up, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded and took Mary as his wife. But he did not have sexual relations with her until her son was born. And Joseph named him Jesus. Now, by now you realize there's a fair amount of biology in this passage, and y'all can describe that or ask questions to one another. I'm not going into it. But here's what I want you to notice, is that God said and Joseph did. But what God said wasn't easy. Did you catch that? Joseph, give up your reputation. Joseph, give up your expectations. Joseph, this will not go the way that you thought it would go. I'm up to something big, and it will matter for all people, and you're invited to be a part of it, but it's going to cost you something. It cost him his reputation. It cost him his expectations. It cost him a number of things along the way. It would cost him his hometown, at least for a time. Everyone would question him. And I just want to say it really, really clearly so none of us miss this. God's way is often costly. God's way is often costly. Followers of Jesus, does that sound right? Has there ever been a time where doing what God said and you knew to be right was actually harder than the alternative, at least on the front end? What makes us followers of Jesus is that when we don't go God's way on the front end, it always bites us on the back end. Can I get a yep? So listen, the front end cost often becomes a detraction from us. The climb up Pikes Peak was grueling. The reward was worth it. And I just gotta tell you, that reward was way better than waiting on an hour-long drive up a twisty road with car sickness. There's oftentimes we shy away from the cost up front. We think that there's something wrong because it's hard, and that's not always the case. Joseph married her. What must everyone have thought? He named him Jesus, which is not how he would have traditionally named his firstborn. And now, I just gotta note this. This is a side note. Y'all can discuss this later if you want. But in a culture that we live in that is obsessed with satisfaction and physical relationship, don't skip over verse 25. Joseph was so committed to God's message being clear and the reputation of this child being clear, he set aside the privilege of a husband for a time. He abstained for a time, which is ludicrous in our culture, and yet he was a man committed to doing what God wanted. There were costs that were big, costs that were small, costs that lasted a lifetime, costs that last for a short time. I'm just saying that when God invites us to do something, often you gotta know it is costly. The reason I'm laboring this is because some people look for better in life. I don't know anybody who's not looking for better in life. And the great news is, a lot of people go looking in Jesus' direction for better in their life. And I just want to say, if that's you, you are looking the right direction. Can I get a yep from anybody who follows Jesus? It's the way to go. It's always better. But I got to tell you the honest truth. It's often harder. Holding a grudge is way easier than forgiveness, and Jesus calls us to forgive. Flying off the handle when we're upset is easy. When holding our tongue to speak the truth in love is harder. And yet that's exactly what Jesus asks us to do. Living for ourselves and pursuing our own comfort feels easy on the front end rather than giving away the good of our life in Jesus' name to others at cost to ourselves. And yet that's exactly what Jesus did and exactly what he invites us to do. So I just want to be fully honest right up front. Sometimes following Jesus is harder, but it is always better. So now Joseph has a family. I'm gonna skip over the birth of Jesus. We'll talk about that on Tuesday if you hang out with us on Tuesday. But this wouldn't be the only surprise Joseph endures. I wanna show you a couple more. His family would actually be marked by people who embraced tough things. He listened to God, he did what he said. He marries Mary and they have a child and it goes exactly the way God says. Miraculous story, we'll talk about it Tuesday. But what happens next is another surprise. Tell somebody, surprise. Because it never goes how you think. You would think that all that cost on the front end, now he gets a free ride. Now it's supposed to go easy. It's all supposed to be butterflies and rainbows, yeah? Nope. Check it out. This is chapter 2. It says this, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. It says, get up and flee to Egypt with the child and his mother. The angel said, stay there until I tell you to return because Herod is the king at the time. Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So that night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother. And they stayed there until Herod's death. Now, if you read on in chapter 2, you'll catch another editorial note. Matthew reaches into the history of God's people and says this is why it happened. But I don't want you to miss this. I've said it twice, but I just haven't said it on the screen yet. Number one, Joseph had a habit of listening to God. This is the second time God shows up and says, here's how I want you to do things. He sends a messenger and says, this is how it's going to go. And Joseph says, yep, let's do it. It's hard, but let's go. He had a habit of listening, and Joseph had a habit of doing what he heard. This begins to shape their family. In fact, it happens again on their journey out of Egypt. In case you're not keeping track of how tough it was, they had to leave their homeland now, not just their hometown, and travel at cost, significant distance to a foreign land and live there for an undisclosed amount of time for safety. Are y'all catching what we're saying here? And wait until he would hear a message to come back. Verse 19, when Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream in Egypt. Get up. This is the second time an angel says, get up. The angel said, take the child and his mother back to the land of Israel because those who were trying to kill the child are dead. And so what happens? He got up. God said, he did. God said, he did. God said, he did, which is what we've been talking about the last 3 weeks. And he returned to the land of Israel, Jesus and his mother. Here's the truth, is that God has good in mind for every single one of us. But the good he has in mind is on the other side of listening to what he says and then doing what he says. And if we allow the cost after listening to keep us from doing the doing, we will never find the good that God has in mind for us. In fact, without embracing the cost at times of what God says, we haven't expressed any trust in him anyway. It's in the doing, the responding, that we declare our trust, that God is up to something, and he always is. On top of all of the risks of this journey and the costs of time away, the family didn't even get to return home. The costs continue. Verse 22, it says this, but when he learned that the new ruler of Judea, the king that was trying to kill the child, is dead, but the new ruler of Judea was Herod's son. I don't want to say that. He was, you can try it with the person next to you, it's fun. He was afraid to go there. So then after being warned in a dream, he left for the region of Galilee. I don't know if that sounds familiar yet. So the family went and lived in a town called what? Where was the town where an engaged girl was found out to be pregnant? Nazareth. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and that's where they would have stayed until they had to flee to Egypt. I assume that's where they anticipated coming back to, but this lousy king had control of that area, and it was better to go somewhere else. And so now the cost continues as they return to the very town their reputations were tarnished in. This fulfilled what the prophet said, he will be called a Nazarene. I wish I had time to go into that. I don't. We'll keep moving. Once again, Joseph was afraid, but once again, God directed him. In the midst of surprise, here's what I want to say, bringing all of what we've said in this series together from Joseph. Not only is it costly sometimes, it costs us in comfort, it costs us in time, but let me just lay out where we've come from. First, in the midst of surprise, we need to wait on God. Tell somebody, wait. It's hard to wait, isn't it? It's hard to wait. We don't like to wait. But if we learned anything from Zechariah and Elizabeth, who waited decades to have kids, and then Zechariah, who lost the ability to speak for a time and had to wait for the arrival of his son, there is something powerful God does in the waiting. Cormac said it so well, when we are waiting, God is working. So I'm just saying, if you're in the middle of a tough surprise right now, and I know you're waiting, and waiting is the worst, waiting on the results, waiting on a diagnosis, waiting on a prognosis, waiting on finances to come around, waiting on the call back from the person that you would love to be back in a relationship with that just will not return the phone call. Waiting is hard, but it's part of the process in the midst of surprise. We wait on God. Then last week we talked with Mary. I didn't say it this way, but I'll say it this way today. Watch for God. Last week we said listen to God and listen together, but that's just constantly on the lookout for what God is up to. Mary listened well to God and she listened in community with Elizabeth. We should do the same. In the midst of surprise, we wait and we watch. Tell somebody watch. And finally, if we're learning anything from Joseph, I hope we learn to wonder with God. Just wonder, God, what are you up to? God, you've said things are good. How is this going to go? This is tough right now. I remember walking up the slope of Pikes Peak, wondering what's around the next corner, wondering when we'll see the peak, and there it was, and wondering if we would ever get through the last mile of rock hopping to the top. Wondering is part of the surprise. It's part of the journey between here and there. And I just got to say, in our culture, we just have this tendency to think that when things get difficult, something's wrong. Does that sound right to anybody else? When things get difficult, I'm like, this can't be the right way. This can't be how this was supposed to go. It was supposed to go more easily. It was supposed to be clear along the way, but I just want to say, who said that? I don't know if you're with me, but I'm just saying, I just thought I want it to be easy. I bet you're with me on that. Can I get a yep? We want it to be easy. We want to be all up and to the right, all flat roads, set the cruise, arrive on time. We are obsessed in our culture with convenience, with efficiency, and with maximization. We think if something's slow, something needs fixed. Or we think if it's difficult, something must be off. But I just want to say this really clearly. Difficult often makes us draw the wrong conclusion when it should make us ask a better question. Our conclusion is something's wrong and we need to change. And maybe that's true at times. It's not always this way. But what it should always make us do is ask a better question. God, what are you up to? God, what good are you bringing to me in this challenge or through me to others in this challenge? God, what is it that you're accomplishing in this slow, costly journey that you have called us on? I just wonder how much Joseph be like, God, why did it have to be this way? What is it that you're up to? What are you accomplishing? I wonder what Jesus' life in Egypt must have looked like. I wonder what that journey, I wonder if Joseph ever put it together that when the wise men arrived with gifts, those gifts paid for a journey to Egypt. God, were you thinking about this journey long before we had to take it? In the midst of waiting and watching, we can be full of wonder. All of us want things quickly and easily, but maybe you've heard this quote, you can have cheap, fast, or good, but you can't have all three. Sound right? In business, this is known as the iron triangle. You got to manage cost, speed, and quality. And it's just always pulling in tension against one another. Well, I just want to say, in our lives with God, I don't see God much interested in cheap or fast. But he is always interested in good. Good seldom comes fast. It's true in food. It's true in relationship. It's true in work. It's true in all. Good seldom comes fast. And good seldom comes without a cost. I'm not saying the cinnamon donuts weren't good for the people who rode the train or drove the car. I'm just saying they weren't as good as they were for me. You can't microwave who we're becoming. You can't cram for the test of being formed like Jesus. There are no shortcuts. Tough is reality. And in those moments where we think it shouldn't be that way, we should just be asking a better question. Because slow in life is all too common, especially with God. But here's what you need to know. As much as slow is all too common with God, good is always on the table. It's not that something's wrong or that the possibility of good has left. That never leaves with God. This is what makes us followers of Jesus, is that in all things, he works for the good of those who are called and who love him and who are called according to his purpose. Whether the thing we're in is good or not. Whether the thing that put us in this situation was good or not. He can make good from it. So is life tough sometimes? You tell me. Is life tough sometimes? I didn't even say that word. That was like gibberish and you said yes. Sometimes. Is it tough sometimes? Yeah, it is. But will God make good from it? Yes. In fact, we only need to look at Jesus to know this is absolutely true. Jesus was the greatest good. No one has done more good in the history of anything ever than Jesus himself. Was it easy for Jesus? Not even close. Was it fast for Jesus? Was it cheap? No. In fact, I love the way N.T. Wright says it. If you just read across the Christmas story, before Jesus could walk and talk, he was a homeless refugee with a price on his head. Listen, I'm not sure when we started to expect easy. I'm just not sure we should. And I'm not even sure when we find out that it's easy that we shouldn't be just a little suspicious. Jesus knew what it was to endure difficulty for himself, and he was only good. He only came to bring good. He was not in a hurry. 33 years. We don't know a lot about the first 30 years, but he was like a faithful carpenter's son. Hebrews 4 says he learned obedience from the things that he suffered. He found his way through, and even his ministry was not easy the last 3 years. If we're gonna talk about slow and not easy, we could talk about 6 hours in which he hung on the cross on our behalf to fully and finally pay for anything and everything that could ever separate us from God, so that nothing ever could. We would never have to wonder if we were loved. No, Jesus wasn't in a hurry. And it wasn't without cost, a challenging life and an unbearable death. But can things be tough and good? Absolutely. He resurrected and he intercedes on our behalf. He sits at the right hand of God, interceding on our behalf, waiting for the day he returns and makes everything right and calls everyone who would ever trust him in his direction now and forever. N.T. Wright goes on to say, there was no point for Jesus in arriving in comfort when the world is in misery. And there would have been no point in having an easy life for Jesus when the world suffers violence and injustice. If he was really gonna be Emmanuel, God with us, he must be with us where the pain is. My hunch is many of you have experienced significant pain. Some of you are right now, and a fair bit of it came at a surprise that's just unbearably tough. It doesn't mean things are wrong. It means things are hard. What it means is we need to wait on God. as he works in ways we don't understand. And we need to watch for God and what he's up to and what he's saying. And we get to wonder about how God will carry us and meet us and shape us and others around us through this. But no matter what, and no matter how hard it is, there's one more W I want to offer you. Whatever you do, keep walking. I think it was Winston Churchill. I keep forgetting to look it up. He said, if you're going through hell, keep going. Keep going. Or the way I say it on hikes, in every single hike, no matter how far, no matter how high, no matter how fast, whatever it is, in every single hike, there is a part that is just terrible. And you got to keep walking anyway. Doesn't mean it's not awful. There were some awful parts in every single one. But in the tough, surprise or otherwise, we keep walking. We keep waiting, watching, and wondering, but no matter what, we keep walking. I want to give you a simple frame very quickly for how to do that, very practically. I'm going to invite you to practice it. Here it is. You might want to take a picture of it. It's pretty memorable, but you might want to picture. We've used this tremendously over the last couple years, and it's helped us immensely. How do we embrace tough surprises? We look back, we look around, and we look ahead. Walking up Pikes Peak, when you pause on the trail to look for how far you've come, it gives you strength to keep walking. When you look around, you realize even though it feels awful and steep and you're kind of tired at times, it's not that bad, just a little bit farther. Let's just make it to the next switchback. Let's just make it to the end of the part that we can see. We can look around and see where things really are. And finally, we can look ahead. At some point, we catch a vision of where we are headed, the summit, and all the cinnamon donuts you can eat, which I did. We look back, we look around, we look ahead. So let me give you a question for each one that might help in tough times. We look back. When has God already in your life made good from tough? Because in the middle of tough, we just got to remember his character, that's what he does. Because when you're in the middle of tough, it doesn't feel like that. And honestly, I don't want to look around when I'm in the middle of tough. I'm looking for a way out. Anybody with me? I just want out. I'm looking for a way out, but we don't need to look for a way out. We need to look back. When has God brought good from tough? And this is why we need community, because you need the person's stories next to you and the stories next to them and the stories next to them. Because even as he writes stories in our life, sometimes we talk ourselves out of it, and we need other people's stories to remember this is what God does. Even when he didn't cause tough, he makes good from tough. And so we got to look back. It'll stir us. We just pause for a moment and look back across the trail we have walked. It helps us keep walking. Number two, we look around. What often happens in tough is we fixate on the tough. And all around us is God speaking, God providing, God caring, God supporting, but we are so dialed in on the pain, and I get it, all of us are there, but if we'll just discipline ourselves, not just to look back, but to look around, like just lift our eyes from the wall we keep running into and realize God is providing, he's speaking. We can ask a simple question, God, what are you saying and what are you providing right now? It just reminds us that he's with us. God is Emmanuel with us. He entered the mess. He's not at a distance just trying to pluck us up out of it. He meets us in it and walks us through it. And so what is God saying and providing right now? And finally, we look ahead and we wonder in expectation of good. God is always up to good. This is what faith is. This is what hope is, a confident expectation of good based on God's character in the past, based on his presence right now where we are. We should expect and anticipate that as awful as today is, God has good in mind and it's on the way. With God, good is always on the table. And so we can just wonder, God, I don't see it, but I can't wait to see it. God, which turn do I come around and see you waiting on me and all of what just happened suddenly makes sense? Sitting at the top, munching on my cinnamon donuts, judging the people who rode in a car on the way to the top. I looked at the long path down the mountain and be just like, wow, I see how those awful switchbacks got me from here to there. I saw that perfectly timed meadow through Devil's Playground that we got to walk through and just soak up and catch our breath. God, what a journey. We get to do the same thing, but only if we keep walking. And so listen, maybe it's tough right now. Surprise. That's how it is. But God has good in the midst of it if we'll look back, we'll look around, and we'll look ahead. So I want to invite you to stand right now and do one of those three things. Which of those three questions is coming alive to you right now? I want to suggest that if you're not in a tough season right now, you should look back and just allow your heart to be full by celebrating all the tough things God has walked you through. Maybe you are sitting at a summit right now. I would love to hand you a donut as you reflect on all the goodness of God, because you'll need it, because there's a surprise ahead. Can I get a yep? Soak it up now. Don't dread. God will meet you in that too and do something amazingly creative in that moment, but celebrate looking back. Some of you are in tough right now and it's been impossible to see anything else. I would encourage you, maybe even physically, to look around, make your body do what you're trying to make your mind and heart do. Who are the people in your life that are surrounding you in this tough time? Where is God speaking? What is he providing? Just take your eye off the pain for a moment and see what God might be doing. And finally, any of you who have just a little bit of perspective, maybe what you could do right now is you could look ahead. You don't need to plan for God. God doesn't need our ideas, okay? But just wonder. In fact, I just want to say this to you who are in deep pain. The less you can see hope ahead of you, the more wonderful God's provision is going to be. The most desperate of moments are some of the most miraculous rescues. It's just his character. I'm not saying you need to feel that right now. I'm just saying it's true and you can hold on to it with all you're feeling right now. Look ahead and wonder how God might provide in a way you and no one else have ever thought of, and you will tell a story for the rest of your life of how good he is. For the next few moments, look back, look around, look ahead.
So when surprises get tough, let's not just look for a way out. Let's look back at all that God has done. Let's look around for what he's providing and what he's saying. And let's look ahead and wonder of what he might be up to. And most of all, let's do that together. If we can support you anyway, along the way, we'd love to. Head over to canyonridge.org where you'll find everything you need to know, along with a way to get in touch with us. If this was helpful to you, I encourage you to share it with a friend, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll see you soon.